Welcome to the Sri Lankan Understanding, a platform on which we explore the path taken by Sri Lanka, an island in the Indian Ocean. We look at the trajectory of the country to the present and the potential for the future. Our topic for discussion today is renewable energy and the future of Sri Lanka. We have an expert who earned his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Moratuwa, his Masters from the University of Bath, and went on to receive a doctorate in organizational change from the Ashridge Business School. He is an expert in the field of sustainable development, looking at it from an environmental perspective, and was the recipient of the President's Award for Scientific Publications in 2014. Dr. Vidhura Ralapanawe. Thank you so much, Dr. Ralapanawe, for joining us on the program.
It's my pleasure.
Dr. Ralapanawe, when we go back to looking at renewable energy, when did people first start realizing the potential of this field internationally?
Sure. So renewable energy has always been in the picture. If you look at the electricity sector in Sri Lanka, we were a 100% renewable electricity driven country, powered 100% from hydropower. What happened was, when our hydro reservoir capacities for generating electricity started being all utilized, we started moving into fossil fuels for electricity generation. Now, energy is larger than electricity. All the thermal energy that we use, whether we are using it in vehicles or in industry or even domestic cooking, are all forms of energy. Now, in Sri Lanka, about 50% of our total energy is actually still renewable, because they are primarily from biomass. Now, when we talk about renewable energy, it's just the forms that were in favor has shifted. So, in the first wave, it was mostly from hydroelectricity. Then it moved a little bit to biomass. And now the dominant forms of renewable energy that we talk about is actually solar and wind power, generating electricity, and the emergent form is actually green hydrogen, where using solar or wind or any other renewable energy source, we break water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen and burn the hydrogen gas to generate energy. So what we have seen is that last 5 to 7 years, we have seen a huge adoption of wind and solar based energy generation, electricity generation, and this is becoming the most dominant form of electricity generation in many countries even now.
But of course, internationally, they were already talking about this maybe from the 80s into the 90s, perhaps?
Correct.
Where people were becoming that much more conscious about the environment.
Correct.
And trying to safeguard the environment or mitigate climate change. The term probably is very much used today rather than it was back then.
Correct.
But measures were being taken internationally and regionally as well before we started doing it over here.
Correct. So we use the word climate emergency or climate crisis because climate change does not communicate the scale of the challenge that we are facing. But here again, we have a very interesting past that we tend to forget. Some of the early forays into solar electricity in Sri Lanka was actually somewhere back in, I believe, 1980s, where we started this movement of even solar plus storage at village level, including battery storage. We were piloting these programs. Of course, the technology wasn't as advanced as it is now. What I've seen in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, is that the early momentum actually stalled in last maybe 7 years, where a lot of other countries have started really ramping up and leading into exponential levels of adoption, and our conversation stopped. And two distinct events are driving this change. The first one, of course, is the climate emergency, and we are not in any way able to manage the climate emergency to a level that preserves the ecosystem integrity and the human prosperity. So both of these are under severe threat right now. And this is why, one reason why renewable energy has become in the limelight. And the second reason actually is that right now in almost all parts of the world, renewable energy based electricity generation is much cheaper. New renewable energy additions is much cheaper than any other fossil fuel addition. And in most parts of the world, including Sri Lanka, new renewable energy forms are cheaper than even existing fossil fuel plants. So there is economics, there is, in a way, the movement started from an ecological pressure, but right now it's ecology and economics are both combined, driving the transition to renewable energy.
And I guess that's where we will see the change taking place. And you used...
I think that's what's supercharging the change.
Okay.
I think the change predates, and we've seen a lot of activists and even politicians and government officials who at kind of siloed level pushed for renewable energy from 10-15 years back. But I think the shift is happening now, and for some reason we seems to be left behind in the transition when every other country rapidly scaled solar and wind adoption in the last 5 years. We've actually stalled. So this to me is the most unfortunate situation.
Absolutely. When we come back on our next segment of the Sri Lankan Understanding, we'll be talking about what is happening with regard to the climate crisis that was referred to just now, and what is the potential of the present. What are we doing right now at this particular juncture in time? When we come back and we continue talking about renewable energy in the future of Sri Lanka. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We're in conversation with Dr. Ralapanawe, and we're talking about renewable energy and the future of Sri Lanka. Before we went to the break, Dr. Ralapanawe, we looked at the past and we looked at where we started, where we got energized to look at this particular field. But in Sri Lanka, we know that the country is heavily reliant on fossil fuels. To what extent has this changed? Has it changed at all?
So I think the tragedy is that our reliance on fossil fuels has increased. Even 5-6 years ago, we were relying on about 50% of our electricity to come from renewable energy sources. Now it's gone back to about 35% in 2019. I'm leaving 20 and 21 out because of the pandemic reduced our demand. And our fuel imports have continuously increased, especially because of transportation and industry. What is good that I see is that there's firm targets that has been put forward by the government, and there are two targets of importance. First one is to generate 70% of our electricity from renewable energy sources by 2030, which is an ambitious and forward-thinking task, which puts us in par with most of the leading companies who are driving the transformation. And the second one is to become net zero carbon or carbon neutral by 2050. That covers all of the energy sources, including transportation, industry, and domestic energy use. So this again, while having the potential and not utilizing it, we are setting ourselves in a pathway that will place us next to the best in the world. So in this regard, I'm very, very hopeful.
Mm-hmm. When we compare ourselves with the international community, where do we stand? Have you seen some kind of progression in terms of what we are doing, in terms of measures we are trying to adopt or we have adopted already, looking at it from an international perspective?
It depends, George, because with respect to some countries, we are doing much better, and our scale helps because being small allows us to transition faster. Okay. But as I mentioned before, the last 5 years where we should have scaled, we have not. If you take countries like Costa Rica, who are right now 99% renewable energy driven. Wow. Small country, so I want to place it as, because there's a myth going around saying that these type of targets are only for rich countries. It's not. It's just the scale of your ambition and your consciousness regarding ecology. So in this regard, Latin America and South America have been fantastic examples of how transition can happen. Most of Western Europe has seen transformation along with UK and US. US has been a laggard, but it's also very rapidly catching up, as well as in Australia. Now, if I use a country like India, I think its scale is a problem, but they have grand ambitions about, I think Prime Minister Modi's target is 450 gigawatts of renewable energy driving the economy by 2030. That's huge in scale. And in terms of scale of adoption, China also leads. China generally is the largest solar deployer in the world, and probably in the top 3 of wind as well.
Wow.
But I can also say that some of the South Asian and Asian countries have been laggards, but I am pretty sure they are also catching up very fast.
So, I mean, some of the countries that you mentioned, Costa Rica at 99%.
Yes.
Now, this is remarkable.
Yes.
I guess they are in a league of their own. Costa Rica is known for a lot of other achievements as well, but to achieve 99% change.
Sure. I mean, during 2019, this is COP25 climate conference. 9 Latin American countries came forward and put a pledge to have 70% of their renewable electricity collectively to come from carbon neutral sources by 2030. So that target was set by a collective in 2019. This is the same time the President of Sri Lanka set the target, although we haven't moved forward on it. And this target is also consistent with what Europeans are doing, Americans are doing, and where Australia will end up, as well as where UK is end up. So that's the kind of a range that we are looking at globally. But I think Sri Lanka can actually do even more and also benefit economically as well.
Definitely. When we come back, we're going to be looking at the main challenges that we're facing in this transition here in Sri Lanka and what it is exactly that needs to be done in this particular area. Also, what is the potential? Are we going to see this happening? Is it realistic? Is it something that we can achieve in the island nation? When we return with the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. We're in conversation about the topic of renewable energy and the future of Sri Lanka. Dr. Ralapanawe, if we go back to a term that you used in the first segment where you talked about a climate crisis, and of course also the term climate emergency, can you expand on that? Because we seem to have taken a back seat on climate change, seems to be something a bit more comfortable.
Yeah. So the words climate crisis and climate emergency is used now because climate change never communicated the gravity of the problem and the urgency for action. Climate crisis tells us it's a huge issue that needs to be addressed. Climate emergency says that it has to be addressed very, very fast. Just to give a context to this, I'll just give you one example. In climate change conversations, we talk about 2 targets that UN set during the Paris Agreement, although the targets go back to Copenhagen in 2011. And the absolute target that we have set for ourselves is 2 degrees Celsius increase compared to pre-industrial temperature, average temperature, and the aspirational target is 1.5 degrees. We are right now sitting at about 1.1 degrees Celsius, so we have very short window to act. But these are political numbers. These are consensus through politics and not through science. Now, what does science say? The chance of coral reefs that we boast about, even in Sri Lanka, the chance of coral reef survival globally under the 1.5 degree scenario is nearly 3%. And the chance of coral reef surviving under the 2 degree scenario is less than 1%. Now, if you combine that, then coral reefs are the most bountiful marine ecological space, And if you combine that with the fact that about 60% of all marine species spend part of their life in a coral reef, you're not talking about a loss of a place that we go diving in, but destruction of whole ecologies and possibly a significant shock to the marine life, marine species. So this is the urgency. Now we are right now not even ready to meet the 1.5 degree target, and that is why it's a crisis, and that is why it's an emergency.
This is where, when we make commitments of this nature, and of course, I mean, Paris was a classic example. It was the leadership of countries that they've got to go back and convince their industries that they've got to conform, they've got to support, they've got to take measures, and sometimes they're also waiting for incentives to be given for them to do that. Maybe that incentivization process is something that becomes very important there. If we talk about the main challenges that we are facing right here in Sri Lanka,
Sure.
Looking at it, it's important to make the transition. We all know that. There's no two words about that. What is stopping us?
Sure.
What is the main block?
If you ask why we have not moved forward, so let me just step back and say what is the transition that we want. We want very rapid addition of renewable electricity into our grid. I am actually hoping that we'll exceed 70% by 2030, but go to 80 or more. Then we need to electrify our transportation system, because the electric vehicles are already here, and it's fantastic for countries so that we can get rid of our fossil fuel import addiction. Then we need to move our industry also to either renewable electricity or green hydrogen, as I mentioned before, as thermal fuel, and we need to move all our cooking to something like induction stoves, away from gas burning stoves. So that's a transition that we need to do. What do we lack for this transition is that we don't have definite road maps to go there. Right? We haven't mapped out this path on how how the transportation system is getting electrified and moving away from fuel. What's the transition roadmap for industries? All of this is lacking, although we've been talking about climate neutrality of Sri Lanka from 2012. Even in the electricity sector, which is the fastest that can decarbonize, we've been talking about targets, but there's no blueprint in CEB to do that. So this has to come at a very rapid level. But I think the two biggest challenges we have in this transition is, one is the institutional lethargy that has stalled our progress across our bureaucracy. The second part is that there are purposeful misinformation perpetuated by experts and people with hidden agendas that still continue to promote renewable electricity even now. Against renewable electricity even now, which is a tragedy. And there seems to be quite a lot of prominence given in different media and organizations like CEB to do that. Where the facts completely say the opposite. Okay, there are people still who whine and cry about cancelled coal plants, okay, with doctorates, who are unable to see that the world is transitioning out, and it's a necessity. It's a necessity of survival. It's not economics. Exactly. For the transitioning out. So I think those two things.
You're someone who's been very much involved in this field for a considerable period of time, and so much of effort has been put into it by yourself and so many other experts who are trying to get this message across that we really have to take action. We have to take sustainable action, which is going to see change in the long term. How confident are you, very briefly, in Sri Lanka and where we're going? Are we going to see results? Are you satisfied with what you're seeing?
If you ask me if I'm satisfied with what I'm seeing, I'm actually extremely dissatisfied, because I think we lost a lot of opportunities to transition faster, and it's actually being evident at this point of time because the global fossil fuel prices have skyrocketed, right? The next coal tender that Sri Lanka is floating is going to come at $220 a ton, where we used to buy at $70. Wow. So the fossil fuel this year, electricity generated from the coal plant in Norochole is going to cost more than what CB pays for rooftop solar tariff, right? So that's the that's the price we pay for our lackadaisical action, right? Now the question about future, I think the conditions right now as such that it's not activist push that creates a transition. I think government has clearly realized that this fossil fuel trap is really ruining our economy. So there are new mandates for electric vehicles that are coming up. Government is fast tracking renewable energy procurement, and we have a bureaucracy that is scrambling to catch up. There are so many things that we can go wrong, but I think both the economic angle and the policy angle are already solved, and this is something that we've never had, and we seems to be the politician seems to be very committed to seeing through that transition. So I think this is positive, but for activists and others who are interested in its transition, this is not a time to let up, because it's that has created this momentum. Exactly. And we cannot rest on our laurels, because the transition is just beginning. But I'm confident, I'm hopeful, which is more than I've been in the last few years, that this transition will actually happen, and we will go towards as close to our targets, and I'm still working towards exceeding those targets, but I'm pretty confident that we will go and succeed this time.
These are things that can be done, must be done. It's not a case of should be done. These are necessities. Correct. These are not options or choices or alternatives. These are things that we have to realize are going to change the future of our country. It's changing the future of the world as to where we are going. And the sooner we change attitudes, the sooner we get rid of control factors that come out of, as you mentioned, industries, which can be sometimes mafia driven. I mean, we can even use that term mafia, which we are also seeing internationally. This is where renewable energy is a very, very important component of the future of this country and where we're going. We've been talking to Dr. Ralapanawe about the issues concerning renewable energy, where we are taking renewable energy into the future, and the potential for this particular sector in our country. And as he very rightly mentioned, one of the things that has to change is the attitude, the approach, how we are looking at this as a concept, and also maintaining the momentum that has been built up over a considerable period of time. Thank you very much for joining us on this particular episode of the Sri Lankan Understanding, where we looked at the past, we looked at the present, and we looked at the potential for the future. Join us again next time when we take up another issue facing the island nation.
Thank you.